ironic that it's actually taken a pandemic to really elevate mental health, from basically just kind of heightened awareness in the last decade to really seeing that employers are really mainstreaming mental health finally, and actually elevating mental health on a parity with physical health. But what we're not doing well is actually elevating mental health and safety, in the same way as we protect people from physical hazards and physical harm. Is psychological safety simply isn't protected in that way. So next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know business in the community, we're the Prince's Responsible Business Movement. We're a huge group of companies, mainly large companies, who work collaboratively, convened by BITC, to actually basically work towards common goals for the benefit of society and business. And really, since the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of research with our members and other stakeholders to actually see what we can learn from during the pandemic, and actually what are the lessons that we've learned and continue to learn during the pandemic that enables us to build back responsibly. Next slide, please. So building back responsibly means managing mental health a priority. So we've actually seen that, there has been an increasing challenge for organizations over the past decade. And as I said just now, we have seen a huge rise in awareness, but that absolutely wasn't translating into organizational culture. The systemic root causes weren't being tackled. But, again, because during this pandemic, employers have been really mindful that actually a healthy, happy and engaged workforce is actually going to be vital to enabling people to be as effective as they can. But, the legacy from this pandemic in terms of what we're dealing with now and the long-term fallout of the trauma, the stress and potential post-traumatic stress disorder. If you look at these figures from Mind, in 2020 reported that more people had experienced mental health during the pandemic than ever before. And the recent research from CRPD found that in the past year, nearly 4/5 of employees had reported some source of stress-related absence in the last year. So next slide, please. So for the last 5 years, Business in the Community has been working in partnership with YouGov in terms of producing our annual Mental Health at Work YouGov survey, which is based on a statistically valid YouGov panel of over 4,000 employees. And, again, I talked about mental health being elevated during the pandemic, but that's not translating into mental health and safety. So if you look at that 41% of employees who've experienced poor mental health related to work in the past year, I mean, you'd never get away with that if that was people being physically injured at work. There's a lot of talk about psychological safety, and no one really quite knows what it is. There's various definitions, and there is no generic definition that's widely recognized out there. But this does seem to be absolutely wrong that, over 40% of employees are being negatively impacted by work. And underneath that 41 stat, the biggest cause are excessive pressure, too many priorities and targets. And, we've heard from the recent news story about first-year analysts at Goldman Sachs, that, their mental health has really deteriorated due to excessive long hours, 91 hours a week, and huge amounts of workload, which is actually in the survey, many of them said that they would consider leaving the company in the next 6 months. 6 months. So although awareness has risen dramatically in the past few years, there's still a really worrying 30% of employees who tell nobody their mental health issues. And, we've just heard about suicide, but, men are significantly more likely to keep work-related issues to themselves compared to women. And, it doesn't always pay to disclose. And depending on the culture of your organization, we've seen through our own survey that those with mental health issues who did disclose had a really negative impact, such as being sacked, forced out, demoted against their wishes, passed over for a promotion, or subject to disciplinary proceedings. So for me, if you think about psychological safety should be the same as operational safety. To do with operational safety, people are really encouraged to speak up if they spot a risk or a hazard to physical health. And basically, in terms of a negative consequence like this, in terms of disclosing you've got a mental health issue and actually resulting in really unpleasant consequences, in many cases it still doesn't pay to speak up. Next slide, please. However, we believe at Business in the Community that actually right now we're at a unique moment in history where actually we've got an opportunity to pause, reflect, and actually reinvent ways of working that really do enhance well-being, mental health and well-being. And, we've seen the unthinkable happen almost overnight. Even a year and a half ago, no one would have predicted that it was possible to have so many people literally overnight working remotely, working flexibly. And in the recent report published by CIPD just a couple of weeks ago, we've seen, a dramatic fall in organizations being more proactive than reactive. So that rise from 27% to 41%. And again, employees believing that senior leaders have employee well-being on their agenda. Again, that's shot up from 61 to 75% in the past year. And, again, we've seen a huge rise in the percentage of employers feeling that their organization promotes good well-being, up significantly in the past year. So I think the pandemic, business leaders have really woken up to the fact that you can't just faff around at the edges. You've actually really got to basically tackle some of the root causes and think about how you embed mental health and well-being properly into your culture. So next slide, please. So, Business in the Community, everything we do is about responsible business and taking a sustainable approach. So that is how I'm going to frame what I talk about. So next slide, please. So Business in the Community, our Bible is our responsible business map. And that responsible business map aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we look at mental health and well-being, we look at it through multiple strands, multiple intersectional strands. So we look at it through good work and inclusive growth, diversity and inclusion, and increasingly you know, along with well-being, the environment has also come to the fore during the pandemic. And what we've really seen, and there's loads of evidence to back it up, is the importance of connecting with nature. That nature is a really important key strand of well-being. And actually the greening of the workplace, or at least the kind of biophilic design, is really key. And all the improvements that we've seen to air quality through lack of commuting, which we are really advocating more active travel and less commuting in the future. So next slide. So at the heart of how we go about kind of driving sustainable mental health and well-being outcomes, it's really important about looking at a whole person, whole organization approach. And really what's happened during the pandemic is finally mental health and well-being has come out of the HR box and actually become the business issue. You know, you need happy, healthy, engaged people in terms of having a productive workplace. And, you know, for the businesses who are doing this well or are the most progressive are the ones that actually embed mental health and well-being into their strategic intent. And basically everything they do has well-being at the heart in terms of how they make decisions. So if you think of every decision in an organization actually considering well-being, that's where you'll see the impact in terms of thriving people, thriving business, thriving communities, because this is more than what just goes on inside your own organization. So next slide, please. So the spine of Business in the Community's wellbeing campaign is the mental health at work commitment. So you'll remember back in 2017 is the Stevenson Farmer Thriving at Work report, which was an independent review of mental health at work, was launched. And basically Stevenson and Farmer identified 6 evidence-based standards, which basically in terms of the standards to construct a mental health strategy. We worked with the Thriving at Work Leadership Council back in 2019 to update those 6 standards. And that's when we launched the Mental Health at Work commitment. If you haven't already made that commitment, I really urge you to do so. Over 1,000 organizations have since the end of 2019. And the reason why it kind of replaces, you know, there's lots of good pledges out there, but in terms of almost overriding all of them with the latest evidence is the mental health at work commitment. If you were signed up to Time to Change, is Time to Change, or what Time to Change was trying to do, is just one element of the mental health at work commitment. So next slide, please. So I said this commitment is underpinned by 6 standards, and standard 2, proactively ensure work design and organizational culture drive positive mental health outcomes. Before the pandemic, this was just felt to be too difficult to tackle. But since the pandemic, is actually this standard is the one that actually has been most affected, and that's where the big opportunities come. So next slide, please. So you'll see how we've embedded tackling this within our wellbeing priorities. So next slide, please. So as I said, to do with our responsible business map in terms of our Build Back Better research with our partners and members, across that work, across the responsible business map, to do with just the wellbeing space, we've come up with 3 priorities. So you saw from that 41% of employees who are negatively impacted by work in terms of developing mental health issues. So the first priority is to address that in terms of elevating mental health and safety on a par with physical health and safety, using the 6 standards in the Mental Health at Work commitment as a framework. And then this objective number 2 is really addressing that standard 2 of the commitment that I just shared with you. So adopt ways of working that promote long-term mental health, building on lessons learned from COVID. And we've seen from the stats that the biggest causes are pressure, excessive work pressure and workload. And then sadly, during the pandemic, you know, in terms of some really challenging issues coming to the fore, like domestic abuse, like bereavement, and we are almost certainly anticipating higher suicide rates. So this is about not challenging away from those issues and acknowledging that they're happening and actually updating your policies and providing support accordingly. Next slide. So in terms of looking at good job design that actually drives positive, well, sustainable mental health outcomes, is we've identified these enablers in terms of achieving the aim of good jobs that do that. So we know that you can't manage what you can't talk about. So therefore, open dialogue around mental health and being actively listened to, and with that feedback is really, really important in terms of, you know, what COVID has done for many people. It has given us a lot more kind of autonomy and control, but obviously one size doesn't fit all, and it's how your role also fits within a broader team, but also that kind of personal responsibility in terms of designing, if you like, how you personally can and have the opportunity to work within the constraints of your organization. We've talked a lot about relationships, and particularly with line managers. And what we've really seen come to the fore during the pandemic is actually technical skills are far less important at the moment in terms of actually, in terms of emotional intelligence. And that goes kind of hand in hand with empathy and compassion, and being listened to. And then appropriate physical environment. And, you know, again, a lot of us are going to be working from home in terms of, I talked a little bit about the greening of the workplace, but also how, where and when you work. And then lastly, the real importance of measuring and monitoring. And it's actually identifying KPIs that are really going to be useful to your particular stakeholders. And we know what gets measured, gets managed. And if you're doing this really well, you should think about being totally transparent and accountable in terms of public reporting. Next slide. So without these 5 values being embedded within the 5 enablers that I just talked about, your achievements will be unsustainable. So this is all about culture in terms of inclusivity and equity, trust and appreciation, authenticity. And we've seen a lot of business leaders in terms of showing their vulnerability as well. And as part of that authenticity is vulnerability is actually something that, in terms of that honesty, has been actually really respected. And then, of course, in terms of looking at this through the various lenses of good work, inclusion, and the environment, in terms of how you make these values sustainable, you need to think through various lenses. Next slide, please. So in terms of making these we've already had this slide, I'm really sorry. Yes, so how do you make good jobs sustainable for your business? Obviously, leadership is really, really key. And actually these stats to do with the kind of lack of consideration from CEOs is, leaders really do need to step up, and there's still a long way to go. So next slide, please. So what we've seen come to the fore is that people really do matter. People matter to business, to society, to the economy, and to our culture. And all the kind of buzzword of people first, they really should come first in terms of your sustainability. And I really like this quote that those organizations that will flourish are those that are as passionate about employee experience as they are about customer experience. The minute you see your employers as consumers, you have a choice to work within your who have a choice to work within your business or not, is the minute that you reframe your model in how you treat them. So that whole thing about, burning out your people and then replacing them, that's actually not going to be good enough going forward. Is actually, I think with Generation Z in particular, YZ, is they are actually far more discerning about the kind of what their employers stand for. It's all about purpose. So actually, you've got to start thinking a lot more long-term around long-term sustainability rather than short-term gains. So next slide, please. So because of all of these kind of opportunities that we've spotted, particularly in regards to that standard 2 of the mental health at work commitment, we absolutely don't have all the answers, which is why we're developing a white paper to drive new ways of working called What If Your Job Was Good For You? And that white paper is coming out at the end of June. We have been conducting qualitative research with our members, our wellbeing leadership team, members of the Thriving at Work Leadership Council, national stakeholders like Paul Farmer and Peter Cheese. We've also got our quant research from the end of last year from our Mental Health at Work YouGov survey, and we've been working with Affinity Health at Work for them to conduct a literature review. So we know a lot of white papers just get shoved in a drawer and never looked at again. But the whole point about this white paper, it's not an end in itself. It's a vehicle for actually fueling engagement with business leaders, driving debate, and actually identifying more examples of ways of working. So that launch is coming out on the 30th of June. It will be publicly available. There will be ways, if you want to get involved and share your learnings, they will all be there in the white paper. So a once in a lifetime opportunity, and think about joining the movement and being part of something good. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking questions.
Thank you very much, Louise. Much appreciated your presentation. We've got quite a bit of time, so we will try and take some questions. I've got some thoughts, but hopefully people will get themselves energized but after that presentation, and we'll use the Q&A box. The first question we have is, one of them is regarding a quote you said in the presentation, and one of the attendees, Helen, would like to know, where did you get that quote from? That
actually came out of our qualitative research that is Basically, that was based on the interviews that we've been running with our own stakeholders. In terms of whether it can be attributable, when the white paper goes live at the end of June, is watch this space, but it is a really good quote. So yeah, it's not in the public domain, but it will be.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for answering that one. Next question is actually regarding the white paper that you mentioned. Is there going to be a cost to that to get hold of it?
Absolutely not. It will be freely available from Business in the Community's website. As I said, it's very, very collaborative. The research and evidence behind it is really solid, but we still won't have all the answers. And in terms of actually having mechanisms where people can learn from each other, that is very much the spirit of a kind of national collaboration.
Okay, lovely. That's really good to hear, because I think collaboration in our sector is critically important, and bringing all organisations to contribute and bring different diversity of thought and understanding to these kind of projects. One question I do have for you, which is something I pondered or I spoke about in my opening remarks today, is around this terminology of psychological safety. And you mentioned it in your presentation, so I thought, well, this is probably a perfect moment to I was trying to develop that element slightly, because even though the definition possibly isn't perfect, and sometimes these definitions never are, as you probably well know, what do you think are the things we can do to try and help understand that concept in a much more dynamic and sort of helpful fashion? Though those of us who are very embedded in this work in inclusion and diversity get the concept, but it's how do we get that to the wider masses to understand what does it really mean? And I wondered if you could shed some further light onto that issue.
I think the truth is, Adrian, it means different things to different people. So you've got the Amy Edmondson Harvard University definition. Then obviously there's a new ISO international standard that's going to be launched this summer, which is synergies with the Harvard Business School definition, but they're still coming at it from slightly different directions. And I think when the qualitative research is being conducted by Affinity with the white paper that's coming out, is the feedback that we got came through really clearly is people on the whole, and these are senior business leaders, didn't want to talk about psychological safety. They felt it was something that was sort of it wasn't tangible, and basically it felt slightly fluffy. So one of the kind of purposes of the white paper, back to my ambition, our ambition around elevating mental health and safety on a parity with physical health and safety, back to that 41%, is people can understand that from that lack of parity between physical and psychological health. But when I was talking about psychological safety should actually be the same as operational safety, so that if you spot a risk or hazard, you should be calling it out, as you are encouraged with physical health and safety. Now, how is that going to happen? Is you saw from that awful stat of 12% that people who did have a mental health issue and who did disclose were subsequently demoted, dismissed, etc., etc. So before that can happen, you have to create a culture where actually having those conversations where you don't fear those kinds of repercussions, negative repercussions, and they do it very well. I was looking at a case study by the Red Arrows, and they actually treat that kind of psychological safety in the same way as they treat operational safety. So it's about the kind of collective team responsibility, but it's also about individual responsibility. And I'm conscious that I haven't really answered your question, but it's work in progress. But I think I really strongly believe this. I feel that that space, call it what you will, mental health and safety, psychological safety, is a space that hasn't really been filled. Look back to that 41% of people who are being psychologically injured. You know, it's just about 15 years behind at least where physical health and safety was. So I think we've almost got to go through a lot of the lessons learned from the protection of physical health and safety.
No, that's lovely. I suppose from my perspective, the concept around psychological safety also is particularly around being who you are and being authentic in the office, and not fearing being different or fearing having characteristics which are very open, authentic, and honest. And I think if you have workplaces that can enable that, then the concept of psychological safety might be more easily understood in that process if it's seen as the same parallel.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's something, I mean, that's more kind of aligned with the Harvard definition. And that's something that we have a campaign at Business in the Community called Everyday Inclusion. And that is precisely about being able to pull people out without that fear of recrimination. And the two things aren't separate, they all really go. And that's where I think there's companies that have very much gone down the Harvard line, and then you've got the ISO crew. Actually, we're really talking about the same thing.
Well, I think that's really interesting to know both of those two projects going on. I think others will want to know more about those in due course as they become more public, and perhaps then there's a whole session there to have in more detail. On another aspect, because I'm conscious that we have got quite a bit of time until the final session, and I'm going to continue talking and bringing up questions unless anyone else intervenes in the Q&A. So please do that. I'm sure Louise would like to answer your questions. But one is around the effect of the pandemic. One of the things I talked about earlier a lot was around the flexibility of workplaces to understand that how people come out of the pandemic will very much depend on their experience during the pandemic, and whether they worked from home, whether they came into the office. Their mental health aspects of that will differ wildly, and how they've been able to relate. In my case, I've been very fortunate that I have an office not too far away from where I live, as I'm here now, and I have been here since August because it's a better place for me to work. Lots of people are in situations where they don't have that ability and therefore have worked at home with relationships, with children, with animals, everything, and has created quite a lot of stress for them in the process. And therefore that fear of going back to work, perhaps for some people, they've enjoyed working from home and therefore are nervous about the travel, the commute and everything else to get back to the office. What do you feel is the way that organisations are going to approach that going forward and working out what's the best to do?
God, you hear so many different approaches, don't you, in terms of, Facebook and, then kind of Lloyds Banking Group are giving up, 20% of their office space. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, you'd want to be listening to what your people want in terms of co-creating something that has the ability to work for as many people as possible. And it's back to, even if I was talking to a senior guy at Royal Mail Group, and it's kind of like, even with key workers like the postie at Royal Mail Group, there's still a degree of flexibility to give them in terms of even people on so-called shift. And I think, to try and answer your question a bit better, I think listening to what your employees want. One size won't fit all. In terms of taking that personalised, inclusive, individual approach is also really important. Yes, understand that there's people worried about and public transport, but equally, I've heard loads of stories about people who are experiencing or at risk of domestic abuse or going through relationship stress. A lot of companies have well tests in their workplace where people can actually take time out from home in terms of, they're lonely. So I think there's a million ways to cut the cake, and a lot will depend on the kind of overall remit from the business leader, where there might not be that much choice. But in an ideal world, is employers should be listening to people and building on what worked and what didn't work during the pandemic.
No, absolutely, and I think that's the building on, obviously, with the pandemic has accelerated various issues which possibly might not have changed for 5 or 10 years, but we've been rocketed forward because of the pandemic in terms of working from home, flexible arrangements, not just suit solely for individuals or groups of people who have specific reasons, but actually flexible working should be open to everybody, and not just to those who possibly previously had required it, because we proved that everyone can work from home. We don't need to have the argument of presenteeism before, which people use as a you must be in the office because you aren't working if you can't be, which was always ridiculous, but it's actually been proved to be incorrect. Do you think we will see a change in that area to even furthermore working from home and not relying on offices at all?
I think, presenteeism being visible, and we've heard a lot about virtual presenteeism, where people feel they've got to be on camera or easily accessible. The more enlightened companies are judging people not by how many hours they work, it's about their outcomes, their outputs. So there's a lot more personal freedom how, where, and when you work. And I think in terms of enlightenment and having this sort of remote working en masse and seeing that productivity hasn't gone down on the whole, has been a massive lesson, actually, for the UK PLC.
So in some ways, a lesson for society that assumptions can't just be made. They actually, you need to be given the opportunity to prove that they're wrong. And the pandemic has provided that opportunity, not that we would have wanted this to happen, but has at least driven things forward where perhaps for another 5 or 10 years, they might not have changed to the extent that they will do today.
Well, not only that is, opportunities to recruit from all over the world, or alternatively look for jobs globally, which is exciting.
Absolutely, and there's more opportunities for everyone as well in that process. So there's less restriction and more availability and more diversity, which comes to my final question for you, and then we will let you go. Actually, we have one in the question and answer, so I will take this rather than mine. The impact of the pandemic, furloughs, unemployment, national and regional lockdowns have led to an increase on reported domestic abuse. Will BITC be addressing that by providing guidance to employers, employees, etc.?
Absolutely. So back in 2018, there's Business in the Community we produced domestic abuse toolkit for employers, and the beauty of collaborating with PHE is we use very, very best evidence, but we also collaborated with all the kind of key NGO and government players. Now, obviously, in the last 3 years, and particularly since the pandemic, the whole domestic abuse scene, obviously rates have soared during the pandemic, as people were locked up with their perpetrators. And the thing that we're really worried about is for a lot of people who are having to work increasingly more from home, they will continue to remain at risk. So we've just got ministerial sign-off this afternoon from Minister from Bays and the Home Office. The toolkit will, the updated toolkit is coming out later this month. Obviously, we've got an impending new domestic abuse bill, which won't have a direct impact on employers, but in society at large, it will, particularly on perpetrators. And if you're interested, is take a look at Business in the Community website, and you'll see on the 13th of May from 10 to 11, there's a webinar giving you a preview of the updated toolkit with speakers, Bays, myself, Sandra, and the Chief Executive of Employers Initiative. So thanks for asking that.
That's wonderful. That's great. And actually, ENEI have recently become members of EDA as well, and therefore working together on this particular issue. I think it's an issue that we, all of us in the inclusion and diversity sphere, think that should be more prominent, and there should be more work around domestic abuse from all elements. And again, this comes back to one of my original points at the beginning of the day around intersectionality and around how domestic abuse is not just a woman issue, it is actually same sex, it's actually across different relationships and different backgrounds and different cultures. I think we all have to be much more aware of that going forward.
Yeah, and not only that, in the new domestic abuse bill, the definition of what we mean by domestic abuse has also been it's been reevaluated, and as you'd imagine, it includes financial abuse as well as physical, sexual, psychological. There is a much wider kind of definition.
Excellent, and that's good to see that that's been done. Obviously, the domestic abuse bill has been a key part of legislation going through the Parliament at the moment. Okay, well, I think we just about come to time there, so I've interrogated you enough, Louise, I think, on that basis. So thank you very much for your presentation, and we will then move on to our final section. So I will let you go now. Okay.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Really enjoyed it.